right, so good morning, everybody. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. I know we've got a lot of familiar faces today, but if you are new to this, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. And this week is particularly exciting for us because this is Fisheries and Oceans Canada Extravaganza Week, not an official title. We have featured programs on marine mammals, microbiology. We just hung out with Diraj Boussalan talking about otoliths and amazing tuna fishery stuff. And today we are diving in with, personally, I must say, my favorite topic over our Fisheries and Oceans Canada Week, and that is how climate change affects key species. This is a topic of interest, of course, to students all around the world, people all around the world, and rightfully so. And so I'm so excited to dive in with Helen Gurney-Smith to blow your mind about all the work that she has done on lobsters and beyond. Thank you a huge amount to all our classes joining live and on YouTube. And without further ado, Helen, thank you so much for joining us today, and take us away.
Hi everyone. Yeah, my name's Helen Gurney-Smith. Thanks very much for having me in today to talk to you about how climate change affects some of the key species that we have, like commercial species that we look at under Fisheries and Oceans. So I'm based in St. Andrews in New Brunswick. So I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Passamaquoddy or Passamaquoddy Nation, which is governed by the Peace and Friendship Treaty. So my position for Fisheries and Oceans Canada is that I'm a research scientist. So what does that mean? That means I get to do science all the time, all day long. I get asked to create new knowledge or find, and fill critical knowledge gaps, which is a big part of what my group does here. And believe me, it is a big group of very inspirational people that we all come together with different expertise to answer some of these really big questions. So some of it relates to field work where we might be looking at how different changes in the ocean might be affecting species and their ecosystems, down to looking at big data and kind of seeing how climate change projections might affect particular regions that we're working in and the species that are in those regions. Or it could be doing different laboratory experiments, which I'll be talking to you a bit about today. So this is taking future climate scenarios, putting organisms into those scenarios, and then seeing what potential they have for adaptation and how vulnerable or not they might be to those situations. So we all know that, hopefully we all know that climate change is happening and that it's affecting both terrestrial and aquatic systems. So when we think about climate change in the oceans, some of the things that are happening is that as the Earth becomes warmer, it's meaning that we're losing some of the ice sheets. There's melting of glaciers. The Arctic sea ice is becoming thinner. So a lot of these things are obviously happening within Canadian territories. Other things are that the ocean is becoming more acidic. So this is ocean acidification, which would be one of the key things that we'll be talking about today. And also oceans are kind of losing oxygen, which means that we're having more regions that are becoming more and more hypoxic. And also there's an increase in the severity and the frequency of extreme events. So when we're thinking about marine systems, for example, an extreme event might be a marine heat wave. I'll just let this video, which is by the Alliance for Climate Education presentation, do a little bit of descriptions about ocean acidification, because I think it's a really great video and it's better than me waving my arms around.
By now you've heard that the way we're living is filling up our atmosphere with carbon dioxide. As a result, the planet's warming. Heat waves and floods are more likely to be extreme, and people's lives will get tougher. And the more we learn about climate change, the more risks we uncover. Since we started burning fossil fuels, the ocean has absorbed about half of all the CO2 we humans have put out. That's why it's called the planet's biggest carbon sink. Now this is good because it's kept a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere. But as the ocean warms, it takes up less and less CO2. And with all that CO2 in the sea, scientists are shedding light on, an ocean of problems. Ready for the first big problem? Some sea creatures like clams, oysters, and coral, their shells and skeletons are getting weaker. Okay, you've got bigger problems than easy-to-crack clams? Maybe not if you're among the 1 in 7 people who get most of their protein from seafood. Or if you understand how unstable the world would be with 1 billion more hungry people. What's weakening the shells? Well, these little creatures are going about their lives scooping up molecules called carbonate ions to be the building blocks of their shells. But when CO2 reacts with seawater, it releases hydrogen ions, which compete with shells for carbonate. With more hydrogen ions floating around in the ocean, our little friends have to spend more energy building their shells and have less energy for finding food. That means it's harder to grow, and more will die off before they get big. So the fish that eat the clams or live among the coral will have a harder time surviving, meaning the fish that dine on them won't have enough to eat, and so we won't have enough to eat. Remember those pesky hydrogen ions generated by more CO2? They don't just take away the carbonate ions that these little clams need. They also make the ocean more acidic. It's already become 30% more acidic since we started spewing all this CO2, and it could get much worse. We could change the ocean's chemistry so much that shells actually start to dissolve. That means if we don't turn this problem around, your great-grandkids might think of reefs the way you think of a dodo bird. And with 1 in 4 ocean species living in coral reef ecosystems, weaker coral could threaten the foundation of the whole ocean food chain. But why panic, right? Life always seems to find a way to adapt, but it needs time. In a few decades, we might make the oceans more acidic than they've been in 20 million years. It's hard to imagine an ecosystem quickly adapting to that big of a change. But things don't have to get that bad. We've started this problem, and we're going to fix it, beginning at its source. Carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels. Learn more at acebase.org.
So, especially with the UN Climate Change Conference, COP26 going on, it's kind of important that we're having these discussions about carbon dioxide being released into the atmosphere and the potential for oceans to be able to buffer some of that change and what that change will actually mean to species. And some of the key things too is that you can have generalized ocean acidification, but then different regions may be affected differently. So, for example, there are terrestrial inputs that can mean that nutrients are washed off the land into the water, and that can create hotspots of acidification, and also rivers can do that too. When we think about ocean acidification in Canada's oceans, we're such a massive country with different processes going on. So there's different ways that ocean acidification can happen and actually intensify. So, for example, up in the Arctic, sea ice melt from global warming means the ice is melting, and that cool water actually intensifies the process of ocean acidification. So it's happening more rapidly in the Arctic, for example, than it would happen in other places. Also, oceanographic processes like upwelling, which is where water is brought from the deep water into the coastal environment, which happens in the Pacific, that can also increase acidification because you're bringing up deep water that has more of an acid profile and bringing it into the coastal environment where a lot of our species, and especially juveniles of our kind of fish resource species, live. Over in the Atlantic, you can have various different oceanographic processes like the Labrador Current deep mixing, which again can intensify ocean acidification. And there's a little video linked down at the bottom in case anybody wants to learn a little bit more about what Fisheries and Oceans are doing to look at some of those different changes and what those different processes are. So the program that I'm involved in looks at the biological effects of climate change and other anthropogenic stresses like microplastics, for example, on marine ecosystems. So this work is really quite a broad mandate that we have. So there's so much to do. We don't have to do it all at the same time, but we're definitely picking off pieces bit by bit. So, for example, it's some of those physical processes like the temperature, ocean acidification, the decreases in oxygen, changes in salinity patterns, so these physical processes and how they affect marine species and marine ecosystems. So, for example, we're going to be talking quite a lot about the lobster today. So it's looking at, for example, at how some of those processes like temperature and ocean acidification might affect particular life cycle events. So, for example, when lobsters molt, when they release their eggs onto their stomach, how long they're carrying them for, how and when those embryos hatch, and if those embryos are successful or not, when they mate, when they might move to different areas. And so that's kind of thinking about how climate change affects like resource productivity, like what are the abundances and the types of species that we're seeing. We're also interested in how climate change might be affecting kind of primary and secondary productivity. So this is like the base layer in the ocean. These are the things that everything else eats. So for example, like phytoplankton and zooplankton. So phytoplankton are like the little unicellular marine plants in the ocean, and then zooplankton eat those, and then other animals eat that zooplankton, and then that gets eaten by fish, and then bigger fish, and then so on into mammals, for example. So it's kind of looking at how climate change can shift some of those what we call trophic levels. Also looking at impacts on predator-prey interactions, like will those change? Will predators have a greater incidence of occurrence with prey items? We also look at how climate change can affect behavior. Like, for example, will it make lobsters more angry, more aggressive, less likely to successfully mate? We also look at how climate change can affect migration. So are we going to see like different shifts in habitat, for example? And then also disease as well. Like, will we see new diseases? Will diseases get worse than they were before? And also invasive species too. So that's like new species that are coming into our system. And there are also some potential benefits depending on where you are in the world. So for example, there might be some new resources which come in. So species that were previously in other territories kind of moving into our territories. It might be really good food species or commercial species. So when we're kind of looking at all these different questions and things that might affect marine abundances, we're thinking about what is the vulnerability of these species to climate change and what is their potential for adaptation. And the information that the people that I work with provide goes into management of marine resources. So thinking about fisheries and aquaculture industries, how will those species be affected by climate change? And how can they put that into like their management model structure so that they can make some allowances for climate change? And by doing that, that helps to then support a resource, support an ecosystem, but it also supports coastal communities that might either rely on those species for food or whether they rely on them as part of their economy. So I thought I'd show you a little bit about the amazing lobster, which is the American lobster that we'll be talking about today. And I'll give you some facts about them. So they can actually live a very long time. They've lived for up to 40 years in captivity, and scientists actually think that they live a lot longer than that. By the time you see a market-sized lobster, like in the supermarket or in a fish market, it's actually 5 to 7 years old, and it's molted around 25 times. So that means it's grown up a little shell underneath that exterior that you see there, and it's got rid of that bigger shell so that it helps it grow. And they actually replenish their calcium supplies by eating that old shell as well. When they chew their food, they actually chew it with their stomach rather than their mouth parts. And you may have seen in aquariums lobsters of various different colors. So that actually comes from a genetic mutation of the pigment. So you can get blue lobsters, white lobsters, orange lobsters, two-tone lobsters, lots of different combinations. They actually have very complex social dynamics, and they can remember a lobster that they've met before. They also communicate through their urine, so they wee into the water, and then they use their antennules, their little antennae at the front, to kind of get chemical signals from the lobster that's close to them. They can swim backwards to escape predators. And predators for them are kind of like ground fish, like cod, for example. And they also will eat anything. Lobsters will eat even other lobsters, but they primarily eat crabs, shrimp, and snails and things like that. They've got two different types of claws, a big crusher claw and another pincer or cutting claw. So you'll actually find that you can have left-handed or right-handed lobsters, depending on which side is that big crushing claw or the one that is used to kind of tear things apart. They have chemical receptors in their feet, and they're generally more active during the night than during the daytime. When the female is spawning, it means that her eggs all go on the underside of her tail, and they can carry those eggs for up to 11 months. And when those baby lobsters hatch out, what will happen is that they go up into the water column, so they're almost at the surface of the water. They're very small. They get swept around by the various different currents that are going on in the ocean before they settle through some of their molting cycles down onto the seafloor. The other thing too is that lobsters are actually inspiring other sciences too. So, for example, in cosmos, in kind of astronomy, they use traditional telescopes aren't able to pick up X-ray emissions that come from, say, black holes forming or when stars collide together. So they took inspiration from lobster eyes, which have all of these tiny little tubules, and they act as tiny mirrors, and they pull in light from all around them. So a lobster can actually see like a predator coming up behind them because they have this like wide angle vision. So astronomers have used that inspiration to create a new type of telescope that has all of these tiny little different tubes within it to amplify that signal, so that they can then see what's happening in the night sky. So lobsters are pretty cool indeed for many reasons. So just a little bit about that lobster life cycle, so we can kind of give some context to some of the work that we're doing. So the female lobster carries those eggs for about 9 to 11 months, and then they go through these various different stages of molting where the larvae, the juveniles that we call them, are in the water, and then they gradually settle down to become what we call like a proper benthic juvenile lobster. So like a mini version of the lobster that we kind of all know quite frequently. So some of the work that we do is that we look at some of these different stresses, and I'll talk to you about a 2-year experiment we've finished up. So this is looking at how ocean acidification increases in ocean acidification, so that's decreases in pH, and also increased temperature affect lobsters as an adult, or how those embryos develop. And then we're also looking at how reduced food, because in the future it's not just lobsters that might get affected, their food might get affected by climate change. There might be less of it around, so we're looking at how some of those other stresses might affect lobster reproduction and success. And so because it takes 2 years from embryos being spawned to larvae being released, that's the length of our experiment. So you can see here we have our various different treatments and our cross treatments, and it ended up in a lot of tanks and a lot of females that we looked after over those 2 years. So you see some of the adult lobsters up in the top there, and then over on the left hand side in some of the tanks and people feeding those lobsters. And the way that we control the seawater parameters like pH, for example, are through these kind of complex controller systems, where there's a probe that detects what the pH is in the water, and then the system adjusts it to make sure that it hits the targets for the particular climate scenarios that we're talking about. So one of the things that we looked at was the impacts of climate change on lobster embryos. So you can see up in the top left, there's a picture there of those embryos on the underside of the female lobster. You can see tiny little black eyes maybe. And then in the top right, you can see that we use different metrics for assessing how climate change affects the type of development and also the rate of development of lobster embryos. So the A is the eye, so we're looking at how the eye develops and how quickly it develops. The B is the yolk, and the C is the overall size of the embryo. You can see some pictures of the embryos down below. So other things that we look at is called the lobster clutch. So that's the collective name used for the entire eggs that the female has on the underside of her tail. So this is really important when you think about resource management, because you're thinking about how many eggs will the female have, and then therefore how many juveniles are likely to be out in the ocean, and then how many adult lobsters could potentially be fished in the future. So the picture that you see on the right there is what we call a normal clutch. So she's got a lot of eggs and they're distributed all over the underside of her tail. Whereas you see the one on the left is called an abnormal clutch, where there's only a few embryos. So that's one of the important metrics that we assess. We also look at the impacts of climate change on lobster disease. So one of the common diseases that we find in lobster, particularly in warming waters, is shell disease. So on the left, you see a healthy individual. On the right, you can just see there's some pitting in the shell, and then the picture in the insert, you can see that there's some really deep pits going on in her shell there. So sometimes they can molt their shell and then not have any impacts underneath, but sometimes it can also affect the shell forming underneath too. So we're looking at how that's affected by climate change. Other things that we looked at too, you see in the bottom left-hand picture, all those tiny little bright dots is little lobster larvae that's hatched out from the eggs. So we're looking at how climate change will affect the number of eggs that will actually hatch. So the number of larvae that we get out, how successful those larvae are with those different molting stages I talked about before. You know, on the top right-hand side, you can see they're very healthy looking lobster larvae. On the top left, you can see kind of deformed looking larvae, which came out of one of the climate scenarios. So we're trying to see what the success will be for lobster larvae, which are hatched out into the environment. And when that happens, how quickly will that happen? Will that happen more quickly, like earlier in the year or later in the year, depending on what climate scenario we're under? And then how do they develop through those different molting stages into being what's a juvenile lobster that lives on the seafloor that you can see on the bottom right-hand picture. So some of the findings that we've had so far are, you know, we have these three different kind of main treatments or major impacts that we're looking at. So warming waters, which is global warming, decreased pH, which is the ocean acidification, and then that other stressor, which is a potential decline in the amount of food that is available. So what we found is that with warming waters, the embryos actually spawned, they hatched earlier, and also the females spawned those eggs earlier. So that's a shifting in the cycle from when baby lobsters will be available in the water. We also found that warming water made lobster females more aggressive and increased the amount of shell disease that we saw on those adults. When we looked at the impacts of pH, we found that ocean acidification actually reduced the number of eggs that the females had, and it actually reduced the hatching success of those embryos, and it led to decreased survival of those embryos too. When we looked at the effects of reduced diet, we found that they got hangry. Just like we get hangry, they got hangry. So it increased the aggression that we were seeing in the females. For the embryo development from those females that were under a reduced diet, we found that it delayed the embryo development. Those females were less successful when they molted, so some of them were either able to molt successfully or they died. It also affected their organ quality. And because we were looking at these all in combination, because it's not just going to be warming waters that happens at one point and ocean acidification happens at another point, they're going to be happening together. So when we looked at the impacts of warming waters with ocean acidification, we found differences in the amount of shell disease that we found. When we looked at reduced diet with warming waters, we found that that increased the aggression of the females and also led to poor body condition as well. And then when we looked at diet and decreased pH, we found that that affected how successful they were with molting, and then if they died after they molted too. Things that we're doing at the moment is that we're using molecular tools to see whether that stress that the females have been, those climate scenarios that the females have been put into, if that's then inherited by the offspring and if it affects the survival of the offspring for a long period of time and the success of those offspring. And so we're looking at changes in gene expression and also some metabolites. And this isn't going to be the last experimentation that we ever do on lobster. So watch this space. There's definitely going to be more to happen soon. So I'd just like to thank everyone for your attention. It's a big group of people that do this, and it's very hard to represent everybody here because it's really a massive team effort. And also, I'd just like to let you know about something else that I'm involved in. So it's the Ocean Acidification Community of Practice. And this is a place where anyone can be involved, whether it's from schools and public to governance to academia to industry members. We're kind of united in our concern about ocean acidification and what it may mean for some communities and some resources. So if you want to join our community, we'd be more than happy for you to come and learn more and to share your stories with us, so you can find out more at that website there. And thanks for your time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Helen. If you want to come out of screen share so you can see us again, have a bit of a conversation, that would be great. I'll just put out to all our YouTube viewers, if you guys want to type questions in the chat bar, please do share there. We'll take as many as possible. But we've got a bevy of live classes. Miss Endicott, Miss Claremont, you're our Canadian classes today. Your devices are off, so you will be able to share in that StreamYard chat bar for our American friends joining us today. All your tech is all set up to go. So I'm looking very forward to diving in with your questions in a minute. So let's begin. In New Jersey, Mr. Brooks' class joining us with 5th graders at Osage Elementary. If you want to unmute your mic, you're good to go. Hey, Mr. Brooks.
Hey, how you doing?
Fantastic.
Hey guys.
Guys.
Good to see you.
They're very excited to see you. They couldn't wait to be on camera. Vincent, what was your question that you had? Shh, hold on, Vincent. How old was what? How hot does the ocean? How much, like, I guess it's like, how much more of a temperature difference do we need to see for the clams, those shells, to really start deteriorating?
Oh, for ocean acidification. Oh, that's a great question, and it's a super complex one because it really depends on where you are. So different seawater has different, what we call different buffering potential. So it can have different effects. A lot of it is species dependent. So it means that some species will be better adapted than others for ocean acidification in the future. So scientists are trying to fill those gaps. I mean, there is some metrics that we use, which are called calcium carbonate saturation states. And so we do know that once it gets to a certain stage, that some organisms like clams and other bivalves like mussels and scallops like that are more likely to be affected. So some of that is happening now. For example, in the Pacific Northwest of the US, they've seen a lot of impacts on the shellfish industry there. Yeah, it's depends on where you are and what species you're looking at.
Yeah, great first question to kick us off, though. Keep you on your toes.
Yes, that's ones that we talk about in conferences. That's a tough one.
Awesome. Way to go, guys. Mr. Sandy's class, our high schoolers joining us today in Pulaski, Wisconsin. If you guys want to come on up with a question, you're good to go.
Right there.
Oh. Hi, guys.
Hi, guys.
Oh, okay. What can we do as students to decrease the effects of climate change in oceans?
My favorite question. Thank you.
Yeah, so the really big question there, the really big answer is really about how governments sign up to their pledges to decrease carbon emissions. And, I am so proud of the youth of the world, because you are the ones who are making people of my generation and older really be responsible for some of the practices that we have. So it's really about the major thing is reducing global greenhouse gas emissions. So some of the things that we can do individually is to petition up, get our politicians, they work for us, get them doing something. And then also it's the choices that we make, whether we choose alternative energies and the promotion of alternative energies, or even like choosing to wash your clothes less if they're not dirty, and thinking about water usage and energy usage and everything. So how your food is produced, reducing food waste, to the clothes that you buy and things like that. So there's a lot of different things where you can make a difference on multiple different levels. And for ocean acidification, the major thing is really that reduction in greenhouse gas emissions.
I'm so glad we got that question. I'm going to do a little bit of a segue here for a minute because you hit the nail on the head. It really is youth asking what can they do. You guys are the ones that are doing things. I think everyone assumed it was going to be my generation, and we sort of did a little bit, but really, like, there's marches of 500,000 kids happening in Montreal and Edinburgh and around the world from your generation, kids that are literally 16 and younger, which is amazing because you guys get it, you understand the science, and you're on the ball with this. So keep it up, and don't waste. I'm so glad you mentioned elements of this. Don't waste as a concept, whether it's emissions or materials or food or what have you, is the ultimate, ethic to live by. One thing, too, for our high school classes, I put this on social media as well. Under a White Sky by Elizabeth Colbert and The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. Two fantastic books for your grade 7 and up, I'd say, that might inspire you guys to think a little more deeply about some of these issues as well. And, of course, resources online. Fisheries and Oceans Canada has some of the best resources for climate change. And so, great question, Mr. Sanders' class.
Yeah, and if I can just follow up on that too. So you may have heard about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So we do assessment reports, and that's where scientists from all around the world come together, and we try and synthesize that knowledge to give to politicians to be able to make informed decisions and hopefully sign up for some of those Sustainable Development Goal climate-related targets. So there's a huge amount of work that goes into those reports. So far, the new physical science report has come out, and then the one that I'm involved in is kind of impacts on ecosystems and productivity. That one comes out in February. So
I'm glad you highlighted this. And again, right now in the world, there seems to be this interesting state of information, misinformation, disinformation, all these things. And with an IPCC report, you have all the world's top experts in a room discussing and producing a report on it. And so I think kids, much more than us, seem to instinctually recognize that value of expertise. If it's someone saying something and all the world's experts saying something, and that value of expertise. And so again, whether or not you read those full reports, there's increasing effort to make these things accessible to kids of all ages.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
We encourage all our classes to check in with that. This is, great question, guys. We could go all day just on that question, but I will take us to Miss Michael's class, joining us in Glenview, Illinois. You guys want to come in the dark? Hello, dark room class. Hi, guys.
Put on the light. Quacko, put on the light. Here we go.
You're conserving energy. I like it.
Perfect.
Can CO2 appear in a lake or a river?
So what was that question again, Donna?
Yeah, can CO2 appear in a lake or a river? Is it just an ocean?
Yes. No. I mean, there is acidification that can happen. So you may have heard of acid rain, which was actually really kind of discovered before ocean acidification was. So again, this is kind of like climate-induced changes which can happen in the lake, and also it can happen in rivers too. So yeah, although we were talking about ocean acidification, changes in water pH can happen in other systems too. And again, that can have some of the same implications for like the food that's available for other species to eat, and therefore species that might be important food or traditional species.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned acid rain, which was a really big issue when I was a kid. And it's a great example alongside ozone depletion of when governments really did get together and change the policies, things very, very quickly. Now, climate change is a bigger issue than these things, but ozone depletion in particular is a beautiful example of the world's governments listening to scientists, taking this seriously, and really taking instant action to make a positive difference. So I'm glad we're starting to see that on a global scale in terms of, green energy and reductions of waste and all sorts of stuff. So great question, Miss Michael's class, and I love the idea of conserving energy. Yes, turn off all your lights, all the class. That's the way. Miss Claremont's class, they're joining us in the chat. Their cameras are off right now. A grade 6 student wants to know, how many lobster eggs normally hatch?
Great question. So it sometimes can depend on the size of the animal as to how many eggs they have and then how many actually hatch. But, a regular clutch will have like thousands of eggs in there. When it's the same with shellfish like clams and oysters and things like that. So they actually, there's thousands of eggs that might get released, but because in the food chain, lots of other things kind of eat it, you're kind of looking at a 1% to 2% survival of any embryos that actually do hatch.
Wow.
So yeah, but that's part of life, right? It's kind of like feeding the other food chains, and yeah. So.
Yeah, we handle all sorts of animals in these programs, and it's really interesting to see those two different strategies. Things like people, where you have one or a few babies and you put all your resources into them and make sure they grow up to adulthood, and things like lobsters, where it's thousands scattered to the wind and hope for the best, like sea turtles and other things. So yeah, great point, guys. One more quick question from our chat bar, and then we'll go back to Mr. Brooks for another round of live classes. Miss Endicott, also at St. George School, and welcome in Ottawa, guys. They want to know what to do. Oh, they're just saying a big thank you.
Yeah.
Long question there, so thank you.
Okay.
I appreciate you guys. Miss Claremont, if you want to share more in the chat, please do. But let's head back to New Jersey for Mr. Brooks. You're back on camera. Welcome in, guys.
That lobsters pee out of their eyeballs.
That lobsters what, sorry?
Pee out of their eyeballs.
No, they don't pee out their eyeballs, but they do actually use urine as a way of like learning something about the lobster that's next to them. I mean, thank goodness as humans we don't do that, because the world would be a messy, very slippery place. But you know, they have these little antennules that they have like chemoreceptors and things like that on them, and you know, they're able to detect like females and kind of what stage they're at and things like that. So they.
I love the segue to a scientific-based pee response. Thank you for that, Helen. That was beautiful. Mr. Sandy, let's head back to Wisconsin for our high schoolers. Hey, guys.
Yeah. How much time do you think it would take to reverse all the damage that climate change has done to the ocean?
Yeah. How long would it take us to reduce or reverse that damage that we've done to the oceans, or if that's even a timeline that we can conceive of?
That is a super good question. I honestly don't know. And you know, sometimes my concerns are whether we would ever get back to that state. I mean, I think what we really, really need to do is to decrease the rate at which these things are happening. Yeah, I don't know whether in some places, whether there's been so much damage to ecosystems that whether they would ever be exactly the same as they were before. I mean, yeah, that's a very somber thought. I wish I had a wand that I could wave and to give you the answer on that one. But really, we massively need to decrease the rate. So since the Industrial Revolution, the open ocean pH has decreased by at least 0.1 pH units, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's like a 30% increase in the amount of hydrogen ions that are in the ocean. And so, yeah, it's a massive change, and we just need to decrease that rate if we can.
Yeah, it is. I mean, these are the big questions that governments around the world are debating and discussing right now. And it's, you know, a lot of it wasn't done on purpose. I think now over the last few decades where we've really understood the science and people have gone on doing things and sort of just cast aside that idea that they need to take responsibility, there you get some culpability. But before, it was just us trying to make a living. I mean, the fact that we're here able to be on a computer talking with one another around the world, the electricity that powers that, our cars that got us to school today, all that is fantastic. But it's led to the situation where we really have made a huge impact on the natural world in quite a negative way in a lot of senses. And so some of these things might be irreparable. Some of these things we're really actively working on getting back to as good as possible. And I think, you know, we feature these in the broadcast, whether it's conservation of habitats and species, that goes a long way. Whether it's, you know, novel approaches to taking carbon out of the atmosphere, both through chemical processes and through physical processes. I mean, there's a lot of really passionate people doing amazing work. We will need to adapt to a changed reality. And I think people are starting to recognize that and do that no matter what we do over the next 50 years.
Yeah, and you know, when you think about like marine diversity, biodiversity, and what's, you know, what an ecosystem can look like, you know, your particular localized ecosystem, you know, there may be species which are winners and losers. And so some of those loser species may be the ones that we don't see as much very often. But, you know, when you think about species such as mussels, which we call ecosystem engineers, because they provide really important habitat for other things to grow on, to grow around them, you know, the loss of some of those foundational species would be a big change in what we would see in our coastal environments. Yeah.
I'll give two big pieces of optimistic hope for all our classes today, because this can be a topic that is it's distressing, and it is. One is that we have the chance to work with so many amazing conservationists. And one thing that we found on a global scale is when you give nature room to just be itself, when you set aside areas where we don't have an impact for a while, it comes back in huge numbers. This is true of fisheries. This is true of forests. This is true all over the globe. If you leave nature alone, it can be amazing both for the natural world and for people in the area as well. I think off the west coast of Mexico, we've seen some really beautiful examples of this with fisheries, which with the Fisheries and Oceans Canada series is important. You leave it alone, the fisheries come back, everything gets, people get jobs, people have opportunities, and the wildlife comes back. So that's one. And two, Oxford University recently published a study, and they just looked at the progression of adoption of green energy technology. They said, okay, over the last 40 years, we keep putting these projections. Where are we going to be in 2020, 2030, whatever? And if you just follow the trend line of how quickly green energy is being adopted around the world, and no magic beans, no need for epic things, the cost has gone down so much that it is now economical, more economical in most cases, to employ things like wind and solar and nuclear and other power technologies that are going to help make us carbon neutral in the next, few decades, if not a little bit longer. And that's really, really positive. So I think, again, your generation, the kids in the class today, you guys are leading the charge, but there is really positive work being done by scientists like Helen and folks around the globe. So room for optimism, I think. We've got time for one more question. Time flies and you're having fun. So I want to head back to Miss Michael's class. You guys want to wrap us up with one more?
Turn on the light. One's coming up. So,
Hey.
did want to show you. Oops. One of our students did this drawing that he wanted to share. This is from Rocco.
Nice.
Oh, cool.
A lot of people have been drawing as they've been listening to you. And then we also have a question here from Vaughn. Vaughn, go ahead.
Okay, so my question was, if this is possible, do you know how many years will some marine animals maybe be extinct because of CO2?
Yeah. So the question was how long will it be because before some animals are extinct because of CO2? Yeah. Again, that's a super complicated question. I think we don't know enough to make those projections yet for some species. Right now, we're kind of looking at the vulnerabilities that we have right now, and then kind of looking to the future and these future climate scenarios. If we're going to be in those positions, hopefully we're not in those positions, so we won't be there. But that is it's hard to give a definitive answer. Maybe come back to the science world in 10 years and then we can.
I love these questions from kids today of all ages. Yes. They're every bit as hard as like the intense conversations at COP26, but with no filter at all. So classes, I'm so honestly, this is the main takeaway for me, is not only did we get the chance to learn about some really, really cool science in action with Helen today, but you guys have proven the exact point that we've been talking about. You guys are so keen, you this, you want to find out all these things, and that's so heartening. And so again, there are so many resources out there. If you guys want to check out more about Fisheries and Oceans Canada, they've got, where is this on my banner list? A fantastic Twitter page, great imagery, great science, links to all these things that we've been talking about today. The end of Helen's broadcast, she talked about oceanacidification.ca, and I really encourage you guys to check that out. And one of the fantastic videos to begin our broadcast was aspace.org, so do check that out as well. Lots of great resources to keep the learning going. Helen, before we wrap up today and say farewell to our classes, is there any last message you want to leave everyone here with today?
There was a question from Isabel Claremont's class, which was about lobsters going extinct because of climate change. How would it affect living things in their environment? So it would either mean that some species that aren't affected by ocean acidification or climate change would become more dominant species. And so that can have effects to say the food that they're eating, but some of the species that are similar to lobsters, like crabs, for example, might also be affected. If, as a closing remark, what I would say is, you guys are the generation, like I said before, that is holding other people accountable I think that there needs to be more research done. There needs to be more people pulling together all the information on climate change and to help answer all of these great, incredibly complex questions that you're asking today. And, resiliency is important for people as well as for our marine ecosystems. So, keep looking for those answers, keep making little incremental positive changes, and hopefully as a collective, we can do great things for this amazing planet that we live on.
What a beautiful way to end. I can't think of a better one than that. Helen, what we do to end every broadcast, I'm going to bring in all our teachers and classes to say a big thank you and farewell. So Mr. Brooks, Mr. Sandy, Miss Michael, and Miss Claremont in absentia with the devices off, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you.